Most Evil Tuesday Train. We are, of course, back with the grind. And today, we're going back to our most normal characters. Although from this side specifically, you're going to see both Jam and Sin, I think. Given how Guilty Gear went at Evo this year, there's not a whole lot to pick up from it. Unless the one of us who actually went has something to say. But they're not here yet. Possibly not coming today, might be recovering from all that. But you're free to join us. This is a beginner to intermediate lounge, US East Coast, PlayStation 4. The password and room ID are in our tweet. In our Twitter, 2_MK_FGC. And should be in the stream title as well. If anything changes and we have to remake things or anything like that, that's where you can find it. You'll know that we each have new combos to show off. And in some cases, even new pressure strengths. But of course, this is going to lead to some more mashiness than usual. And a little less neutral as we keep on trying to get our new damage. However, as we've all noted before, we tend to play this game from the other side, learning where we would benefit from more damage, and then working on which things would increase that particular damage point. But the afterimage effect, i.e. players' tendency to hit things because they failed at hitting them before, is likely to play in here.
アポステリオリな感覚で申し訳ないけど、あなたでは私に勝てないわ。私の理論値上のスペックは人類を上回っているからね。お、新しい仲間か？はい。まずはジャム。さあ、楽しもうぜ。
It's always important to make sure that you have kept all of the parts of your matchup knowledge in mind at the same time, as you may otherwise end up relying on one thing too much and making yourself predictable to your opponent. In Jam's case, for example, she must remember to actually charge her cards and pay attention to Kai's current mindset to know which card to charge. More predictable opponents generally can be taken advantage of by aiming not necessarily at their weak point, but more so at their strong point. If you can get a predictable opponent to keep doing the same thing and not damaging you, you can build up various forms of advantage through this, especially if you are the one gaining meter and they're not. Similarly, if you're gaining in terms of space on the screen, you're having a similar effect. Some people become more confident and willing to take more risks when they get to do their own stuff for too long. But if you can lock down the other option and make it really blatantly not a good idea, you shouldn't have too much problems with this. One good example is if you've realized that Jackal has minions in places that you can easily keep avoiding for a longer time, you have no real reason to destroy her houses at all. The other player will come to the conclusion that they have an advantage that they may not really have, depending on what you understand about the nuance of the situation that they don't. Similarly, playing a long-range game with her and having Jack O continually manage to block. When you're spaced correctly with Jam, it's completely advantageous to you, as you are gaining large amounts of meter, whereas Jack O is gaining very little. You can then do the change up at the very end. Finish them off once they've got sufficiently low health that a block isn't necessarily going to matter to you. And you could, for example, combo into something that would manage to kill by chip. This is something you tend to need at the intermediate level, where your opponent is playing well enough that you can't necessarily stop them from doing their stuff, or they're not doing things that are unsafe enough for you to just punish. You need to learn to identify which of the things they're doing are not hurting you a lot, or could lead into big damage if you had more resources to punish them for it, and baited or set up something around it. Jack-O has this advantage in a lot of situations because she can encourage people to destroy particular houses by putting down that one in front of them all the time, while the ones she really wants are on the other side of the screen. She has the further advantage of, in situations where things are very heavily distant, she doesn't have to go in to put down the house she wants near the opponent. She still has the capacity to place one right next to her while they're playing defensively, pick it up, and throw it at them. This is one of her particularly stronger strategies there. To put this kick house safely behind the opponent and distract them with the others. Eventually, she can go for a big attack on an opponent who is generally trying to stay close to the ground. If nothing else, she manages to build up relatively strong houses and minions without doing too much of anything. If she could manage to hold the life lead fairly even, or completely even, while doing this, she gets to cash in all that bonus damage and pressure at the end of the round to seal the deal relatively quickly. Kai is not a character that's so good at taking advantage of this, but rather it's from the other side. It's easy for a Kai player to fall into the trap of doing good defensive things that aren't really getting much damage, or even keeping the opponent out that well, but are definitely keeping him from taking too much damage himself. If you manipulate this, you can often get the Kai player into a bad situation. Hence why being a little more daring, or using a lot of Kai's pressure, tends to be the better plan when you are not at advantage yet. When you have a life lead, or some other blatant advantage, he can do a decent job of pinning people down, especially when they're nearer the corner, without worrying about this too much anymore. But you do need to pay attention to whether or not you have enough advantage to play that pure defensive game, especially given the pace of Guilty Gear as a whole. Guilty Gear Neutral can be somewhat slower than the other games, meaning that you get to spend a lot more time getting closer to timeout. This is normally fixed by the large damage cash-ins that you get later on when you have a large skill with your combos. But until then, especially in the beginner level, it's not too uncommon to see a timeout style situation, even if the timeout doesn't actually happen. You get close enough to one that both players have to consider whether or not they intend to try for it, or need to worry about their opponent trying for it. You can absolutely deal with this by increasing your damage output instead. But against some characters, that really isn't going to be an option. You see here that Akari needs to be much more daring, and is generally doing a good job of that. Whereas our Jackal might be going in a little too hard, or rather being a bit too binary about going in or not going in. A lot of the games are spent convincing your opponent that an attack is coming and then not making it. This buys you time for all sorts of things. It also increases the mental strain on them, and in a long set can lead to outright exhausting them. However, of course, certain characters are not so good at this aspect of it, and rather do it by keeping up long pressure strings that don't really mean anything. They're not intended to actually have any effect, other than keeping the opponent from moving. If they happen to work, good. This is Jam's general mode of play. If you don't have your dead angle yet, she can just basically beat on you with the same moves over and over, if you're not ready with your spacing or your invincible reversals. But eventually, she usually has to try to cash it in at least. As most characters, if they really want to, can just at least partially green block out of some of her stuff. Therefore, she does have to at least attempt some throws, some mix-ups, and see if she can guess when the opponent is going to try to get out in the standard way. I do tend to play characters who have this capacity to just keep hitting buttons in your face without being able to harm you until they sense that you're going to go for something else. It may seem like guessing, but a lot of the time, you're not guessing on which button to hit. You're guessing on the duration of time your opponent will spend before they try to do something else. In Jacko's case, this is done in the opposite way. Moving back and forward quickly toward or away from the opponent, especially in the air, tends to create the same feeling. All she needs then is a good chance to get her command grab going. But understanding that the opponent must try to attack a specific spot is usually the way she deals with the problem. She has a much harder time than most characters in those cases, but can do it primarily by assuming where the opponent is about to attack and just making sure she's not there specifically. She has enough long normals and freedom of movement that once she's basically figured that out, her opponent tends to waste a lot of time without being able to effectively do anything. Added to that, her extremely long range standing dust. And the main issue she ever has is trying to punish things, because she's not generally a character that punishes a bunch of things. She's much stronger at waiting for the next attack and dodging it. However, if you can, with Jacko, manage to get your opponent to keep doing something that does not harm your minions, and the minions in question are minions that you can use in that matchup, the problem will be reduced relatively quickly. Jacko's heavy resource management requirements, however, can end up telegraphing to her opponent when to make certain moves. And this is why it's so important as you become a stronger Jackal player to make sure you get the houses down so your opponent has to worry about something else and have that take up their mental space, while you focus on either distracting them more or dodging. Given the distance that she can stay at, it's much more likely that the opponent will expect her to try to make the first attack. And her own long-range buttons make it generally feel like she should be able to do this, but don't count on it. One of her safest options is to just use her standing dust at Matt's range, creating a mix-up with her command grab. While Space jumps with her jumping kick at Matt's range also cause similar types of problems, to the opponent anyway. The key to playing her in this style, therefore, tends to be taking a break between your attacks to see what your opponent is up to. But at the same time, you really can't decide to play defensively and stop attacking. So you must find a balance in the rhythm.
参考の条件は十分ね。世が世ならパーラーで生妻ごっくんな白衣グラマーをトレンディーなスーパーカーでハントしてランデブーからのマンモスラッキーじゃない？え？王様？わお、ヤンエグじゃない？
So, what can Kai do to make Jam have the same sort of reaction? Doing things that don't really benefit her. He has a lot of moves that deal with her approaches if he goes into the air himself. Jam can deal with Kai's air approaches, and she can even do a little damage. But she won't feel safe either trying to charge cards or going for much pressure. When she does, she will have to charge some specific ones. In short, Jam is most comfortable when Kai is on the ground, and she is free to do things in the air. Because while she may be hit if she makes her air approach incorrectly, knowing that Kai is staying defensive enough that she even gets the opportunity means she has a lot more options in terms of getting powered up and ready to put on pressure. It can be harder to play Jam while coming up with her game plan for offense while worrying about Kai's position in terms of his attacks. And the more time he spends in the air, the harder this becomes. Grounded attacks, on the other hand, she can generally move around like this. As you can see there, Kai's defense remains quite good, but even little things allow her to make some forward movement. As long as Kai remains on the ground, he has a good chance of damaging Jam if he does the correct thing, but not a good chance of controlling the fight. However, if you use mostly the same method for it, Jam will eventually bait you into responding and just use that time to card charge. Turning any aerial encounter into a big deal for Kai. Kai is therefore generally better off air dashing forward, using his air fireball and hoping she runs into it, and if she doesn't, just keep himself focused on hitting any of his other buttons in the air, as they cover so much space in front of him that Jam's relatively shorter attacks can't actually do anything. He can bring her down using the fact that in Guilty Gear you are able to make 2 air attacks if you did the first one early enough. Similarly, many characters in this game can stress Axel primarily by retreating as far as they possibly can, and then trying to make their approach while air green blocking. This is not because you expect it to help at all, but rather that you specifically want to land at a spacing where Axel is disadvantaged. Forcing him to stop using that particular method of keep out. But if you build up enough meter, your other option is to roam and cancel the jump and actually land your attack. Since Axel is not so good at moving forward safely or quickly, but is good at stopping you from getting directly to the space you want to be in, your best bet is to start from really far away and try to control the flow to get in from, especially since a lot of his moves knock you back anyway, meaning that you don't tend to lose out so much in the meter gain department while doing this. Jago can actually use this as well, but unlike Kai, she has fewer ways to attack Axel properly from the air that don't involve somehow pushing him back so that he cannot defeat her punch or kick houses. However, starting your attack from the standard position that Axel knocks you back to is almost always a bad decision. The nature of the design of the character is such that if you try to attack immediately from where he puts you, you're just back in the same literal chain of attacks. However, since Axel has to cover so much ground in order to manage anything from the knockdowns in question, it's really easy to wait a little while and see if he's the one trying to move in toward you, after having realized that you either moved to or were not to full swing. Generally, therefore, when Axel does knock you down, you should probably wake up backdash simply to be as far away from him as possible and solve the flaws in the spacing. Rhythmically speaking, if you attack immediately, Axel normally will have some answer there. This also applies if you back tech from a knockdown on your way in, as he tends to have very little he can do about it. His long recovery whenever he misses means that any character with a long enough attack, especially a knockdown, can cause him problems in these situations. So when facing Axel, do your best to build up the habit of taking a break after each attack he hits you with, even if it's blocked most of the time, because he's meant to space you directly after the blocking. it can be relatively easy to determine beginner Axel players by that same principle. Their tendency to just do their next attack directly afterwards to save themselves from the trouble of having to actually react to what you were doing. As they get better, they learn to read the rhythm of the match and decide whether or not to do that based on the opponent's flow, the amount of meter on both sides, and so on. Kai, on the other hand, has an easier way of dealing with this, in that Kai can hang in the air and appear to be moving forward, while still setting up an attack that should hit Axel or trying to keep him out. This is because Kai's air fireball moves him out of the way of a lot of Axel's actual attacks. The timing for it can be difficult though, as you can see here, because the forward air dash involves a motion that makes it difficult to prevent. So, Kai's better option is similar to the other characters, except that he doesn't have to wait. If you want to master this with him, most of the time you want to do a running jump, which will take you into the correct spacing, but should not have stored a forward input long enough to prevent you from using the thing correctly. Similarly, therefore, Kai must start from nearly full swing, but he does not have to start from full swing. And he has the added advantage of being able to use that running jump to extend the range of a lot of his normals. Air normals, that is. And even specials like Greed Sever. He's also a character who is strong at dealing with Axel on the ground through the same fireball or charged attack, meaning that Axel generally wants to get at least a bit further away from Kai, making it easier for Kai to read this and move backward like any other character to give himself some space. One of the few who can literally jump straight up to avoid Axel's counter zoning and still get something off it, meaning that he can more or less play this game as a sniper. Who is facing a different sniper who is at a lower elevation. Generally an easy thing to do. But as you can see, Kai's uppercut can be used in those situations if he realizes that the opponent has taken long to respond. The difference is that that's the timing when, had you been trying to do the fireball, you would actually succeed. That, therefore, is the complex part of this. Most of the time, you want to specifically not do the projectile when you don't mean to, and it can't be option selected as easily because the times you want to do the vapor thrust are times when, if you did the same input, you would probably end up throwing the fireball. Of course, there's a lot more to this matchup than that. But we are talking about first order strategies, ways to deal with the Axel style that knocks you away and continues to try to do that specifically, rather than directly reacting to your movement. As demonstrated there, even if you don't land a full attack or combo, attempting to get to that particular spacing means that this is probably the most uncomfortable spacing for most Axel players who are not familiar with some of his other moves. They don't want to use most of his slower attacks, but there's no easy way for them to get back to where they want to be either. Leading to them needing to use some fairly daring and gutsy tactics in order to get out of those situations. One of the bigger differences between players and characters that zone like Axel with very long attacks and those that use actual projectiles, especially full screen ones, is usually related to exactly this. You can counter zone characters who don't reach the whole screen at times by simply going a whole screen away. And at least starting your offense from there. As those characters tend to lack methods to close that distance without telegraphing themselves. And since they're uneasy usually at those spaces until they get much better at the game, ending up in spaces not necessarily right next to them, but a little ways away where most of their slower attacks would then become disadvantageous, can be very good for you. It then becomes a matter of patience and focus on both sides, as both players learn to delay their attacks just a little bit, or to move away from the opponent in the correct way. Axel needs to not try to walk back to his position immediately, just in case he does benefit from hitting a button, and he just has to not hit one of the stronger ones. His opponent in turn can take a small advantage of this, but still generally shouldn't just attack head-on if Axel has managed to make them block. So his goal is to find a spacing at which he can make them block with a lighter button that he can control, and then try to anticipate their next one, because walking away from them often leaves him open and on a psychological level is much more likely to make the player nervous.
にとらわれるのは愚かとか言うけど、過去の遺産が柔らかいということに感謝しないで座ってるよりはいいと思う。頑張って元の時代に帰ろう。
If we look from the more complex parts of the matchup, for characters such as Jam who need specific setups, you can see how general tactics are formed. The first thing Jam needs in this situation is her charged Dragon Kick, because this will punish a lot of things that Axel does, and therefore this is the first thing she wants to keep charged at any given time. It will make her less likely or willing to try to advance, and therefore unlock her ability to charge other cards. Once she has it, staying away from the opponent seems much less scary. And frustrating them into taking an action so that she can actually put it into use becomes easier. But note again, she doesn't have it right now, so I have to charge it again. That, for example, was missed execution, as in having tapped forward in order to intimidate the opponent, and ending up trying to do the Dragon Kick from there. Always be careful when you have a plan you've never tried to execute in a match before, especially on characters with complex execution. But similarly, note that I don't charge the dragon again until far enough away that it could obviously have ever come up that I need to use it. A lot of Axel's longer range attacks are actually outright reactable because of the way that they will whiff when using full screen attacks of your own. This is of course harder if it requires you to actually run and jump, or do instant air dash style attacks to close the distance. But we can each learn our specific timing for it. And Axel in turn has no real immediate answer from that range other than to calmly keep quiet. He can take some risks with his advancing moves, but a lot of the time these risks have the same problem as trying to use defensive moves. They recover slowly enough and put him into easily attackable spaces, meaning that you can just whiff punish those too. Therefore, to play Axel successfully, you must generally be using some very oppressive psychological play. You have to get inside your opponent's head more so than you have to worry about the execution of any given thing you're doing. Because if they manage to get in your head first, basically nothing you do is going to come out to anything. But if both your attack and Axel's attack whiff, don't feel bad about it because that's basically the entire point. Note precisely the spacing you landed at and consider, is this a good spacing for you or for Axel? If you landed in a good spacing for Axel, you might want to do a risky move or wait for him to push you out and retry. If you landed in a space that even looks like it might be good for you, think of what you might be able to hit, rather than trying to retreat to start over. Because your aim is not to get in, but rather to just make the situation better for yourself. And of course, one of the best aspects of this is that if you have convinced the Axel player that if they manage to push you out from that range, that they should wait and try to read you because you're going to try to backdash or something anyway, that moment where you choose to not do that and your instincts do kick in, and you go straight for the attack, they might not be expecting it. This sort of strategy is really not that uncommon. If you have the capacity, especially in this sort of fighter, it's quite possible to zone zoners. Or at least particular ones. Learning to measure whether or not you're at advantage or disadvantageous space, and which buttons to attempt to use at those moments, is key in any matchup. But it is definitely true that zoners tend to make it take longer before you can set up advantageous spacings, and you don't often get to do it from the end of your own attack strings. But back to the original point, all of that came up because of recognizing that you can gain advantage without actually getting a hit, even if you are getting your opponent to do the same thing over and over again. In Jam's case, for example, if you expect that your opponent is not going to be opened up by anything, but will block in particular ways, if your spacing was not perfect, you can generally jump over their head to try to make it so. And you can do this mid-combo. You can just jump cancel stuff for no reason. More importantly, if you are actually fairly good at the character, you can react to your opponent's movement after your jump cancel without having too much stress. This is a good way to keep up pressure on someone and force them that when they knock you back and do escape you, that they do so in such a way that you can keep up your own offense. And obviously that you don't take too much damage. Rushdown characters generally win by making the opponent panic and when the opponent is unfamiliar, this often comes up primarily by doing things that they aren't sure if you have a plan or not, meaning you can be at least somewhat random. If your character has a lot of options, even people who are very familiar with almost if not all of them can still be thrown off a little bit, like being simply given too many things to think about. principles applied to Axel can often be similarly applied to Jack-O. The difference being that when you land close to Jack-O, you are facing at least two very real, very quick options. Meaning you have to commit to something, whereas you can't watch her for as long as you can with Axel unless you have an invincible move of your own. But if you convince your opponent that one thing is going to happen, or if Jack-O is too flustered due to either having been got in on when not expected to, or trying to deal with putting down houses, it can be relatively easy for you to win that spacing game. Particularly if you have more meter than she does, and can go for Roman Cancel or Super, and generally stress her out that way. Another strong option is to move yourself a little bit too far forward and tempt Jack-O to go for particular versions. If the player is the type that reacts to spaces suddenly and doesn't have a lot of experience in when their opponent has a read on them, you would often be able to backdash out of her command grab and her main usual attack for that situation. You'd end up blocking the latter, although you should make sure generally to stand block and not worry too much about getting clipped on your feet. Or get a punish off of her whiffing the command grab and basically looking silly in front of your face for a little bit. Setups like that are this character's forte. Realizing that yes, you could get away from her Legion driver, but you would have to jump up into one of her minions. Alternately backdash, which still gets you hit by minions. Generally, you should assume that if she has minions just about to be behind you, that even if you don't have to deal with the command grab, there's definitely more threatening. And even though responding to that threat is in itself often the problem, sometimes you have to count your losses. This is a little easier when they're in front of you, as you tend to not be in position to get hurt by them in the first place. However, it is possible for an S-House minion to end up over your head in a way and timing that will make it possible for her to set up the same sort of thing. Unfortunately, as both players got lower on health, the rhythm shifted, with Axel as once again making his attacks directly after the last, and with Jackal attempting to approach immediately. The result is as one would expect. As you can see here, actually trying to hit Jackal, such as that, will keep her quiet and will manage to set up things. But it's the same thing as what we were discussing the other way around. Jam is landing hits, but she's not actually gaining anything. If the Jackal player is in a position where she can get Jam to keep doing that, she absolutely should. Not only is it difficult to follow it up with anything that Jackal can't stop, the spacing required often means that you didn't benefit at all, even if you hit. In fact, the main reason you'd ever want to do that is if you find yourself completely messed by minions and just need to get them off you before anything bad happens. It's much more effective to take some risks in order to try to get your opponent to think too much and therefore lose track of the situation that has become advantageous to you, even though they haven't been hurt. A lot of these things, therefore, at least in this game, rely on both the speed and distance of your character's backdash and air backdash, and to some extent, the velocity of their run before they go into attacks. Do they build up over time? Do they tend to move immediately? And so on. The height of jump can become a factor if you can use it to completely avoid attacks, but not many characters have such high jumps that you can do this and still manage to land or launch a proper attack. Fortunately, for demonstration, we have two such characters here. Both Jam and Jack-O are capable of doing these things, and they have good run as well. It can be difficult to get a really good idea of this as in how to use it, but we definitely suggest that before you try out any new character in a serious match, take some time in training mode to do their dashes, back dashes, and so on, and test their jump. So that even if you can't figure out how to make it super advantageous to you, you at least have some expectations and are less likely to get flustered when something happens that wouldn't happen on your normal character. Therefore, you should make sure to literally put your best foot forward in these situations. Whether that be to jump into the air, or to charge straight in.
評価試験にもならなかったわ。まあいっか。弱王勝ちだ。参考の条件は十分ね。世が世ならパーラーで生妻ごっくんな白衣グラマーをトレンディーなスーパーカーでハントしてランデブーからのマンモスラッキーじゃない？え？王様？わお、ヤンエグじゃない？
I would totally play this music all the time, but I figured you'd get sick of it if I kept chipping. But it's time to mix it up a little bit. So on this side, we'll be switching to Sin Kisuke. And looking at the flows caused in similar situations for that character. Leaving you to take nothing else from this. Learn 3 basic principles. If your opponent is good at keeping you out, retreat all the way to full screen first before you try to get in on them, depending on your character's capacity to run and jump, or air dash. If you do still get hit, and you recover, or if you see an attack coming and know that you've mistimed the approach, make sure to use your faultless defense, your green block in the air, to prevent some damage at least. But moving forward anyway, so paying a little meter there can save you some trouble later. You do not generally gain more meter than you use if you use this approach, unless your timing for how to activate is really good. But that can improve over time. Overall, your aim should be to make sure that you're not taken by surprise by your opponent's defensive methods, and that you land in a position where you have enough advantage to feel as if you could hit the buttons yourself, without being sure that they were going to counterattack in some way you couldn't stop. Characters like Xin who can counterattack from full range themselves also still have other options such as strong backdash and direct upward jumps. Not to mention being able to take some time out of battles to eat when enough distance has been put between him and characters like Axel. Characters who are able to empower themselves in lulls in the match like that often need those power-ups just to keep up with strong zoning characters. So you should absolutely focus more on getting those power-ups and understanding how to use them than on refining your methods of getting in, because as you get higher and higher in the echelons of how to play the game, your opponent is going to be more and more effective at keeping you out. And keeping up with it using just your skill at getting in can be fairly hard. Furthermore, if their damage exceeds yours enough, it really won't matter if you get in 6 times if you can only afford to fail getting in and take actual damage doing that 3 times. Guilty Gear in particular is a game where just attempting to get in and managing to do it correctly so that you don't get hurt, assuming you did not need to use a lot of resources, will recharge your resources for you even though you never actually got to land or even potentially try an attack. It is this sort of thing that you find in a lot of, as they're often called, anime games. Whether it be the tension and warfare meters of Guilty Gear and Unius, or simple things like being able to use offensive forward dashes as cancels in Sailor Moon S. Even if it isn't directly a massive advantage to you. It's usually enough to make the opponent hesitate and have to think about whether or not their approach to the matchup, i.e. putting as much space as possible to get control, is really going to keep working until they actually win. feeling comfortable in your tactics, even when your opponent is in fact able to counter them, is also an important part of high-level play, and you should start building it up from the beginning. If you spend too much time caring about the fact that your opponent has managed to counter one of your tactics, rather than simply shifting it back into the reserve part of your arsenal, you end up feeling crippled against high-level opponents who, for whatever reason, have a good string of defense or scramble interactions that seem to shut down everything you're doing. It's actually this principle that you have to learn to do yourself. Recognizing whether or not any given opponent is the type that gives up when you stop something once or twice, or if they basically can't be conditioned and they'll keep on trying indefinitely. Generally, you want to be less nervous against players who switch to their next thing in line too easily and basically stop doing the last thing that you stopped entirely. This usually implies that their strategic adaptability is low, and if you can manage to guess and stop the next couple of things, they'll just give up altogether. This is something you can encounter in quite a few online games, where the opponent simply gets discouraged and quits because you spent too much time stopping things that they were trying to do. However, it's still useful in another way. There are quite a few opponents that will want to keep fighting you, as in not get actually upset about it, but still give up in those situations. They're generally trying to reset themselves for the beginning of the next round or whatever. And generally you should just take the win. Being able to stay confident in your tactic and basically put it on the back burner while you try something new or crazier can also oddly help with your meter watching. Since usually a primary tactic does not require much if any meter, otherwise it would be probably a secondary tactic. Not knowing what else to do can be an inspiration point for finding something new and metered to do. But it obviously also helps to have such a specific thing in mind, or maybe even a variant on what you were doing before. This ability helps you remain in control of matches because you can just use the meter thing, and if you are successful, put on some pressure and then go back to doing the other thing.
あなたいいわよ。私もムードより食欲。もっとその元気をちょうだい。
Similarly, you can see here that Kai and Xin must both take some relative risks against each other. Everything from Gold Burst baited in neutral to slightly after Wake Up Super. to get advantage on the other, because fighting conventionally will simply lead to both of them grinding away most of the time in the match without any actual progress being made on either side.
あなたいいわよ。私もムードより食欲。もっとその元気をちょうだい。
恨みこなしだ。デュエル1やっちまえ。終わりか。もう ていないな。はい、勝ちだ。デュエル3、さっさと次行こうぜ。うまい、そこだろ。無理んだよ、そこだろ。そこだろ、今だ。うまい、ここだ。よっ、てよっ、バシッ、今だ。シェフのそこ、ディックだ。スキアリ、これな、これな。今だ、ディックだ。やばいぞ、ここだ。ストップ。今だ、クリアだ。
Similarly, a large part of the Sin versus Kai matchup relies on Sin being very comfortable and confident on the ground, where his father doesn't have quite the same range and has to take a few more risks at least in order to get anything started. While Kai can definitely counter zone Shin with his various fireball style attacks and charged fireball attack, Shin can vault over most of these on reaction, and Kai can't afford to just do these from the air, as Shin can not only slide under almost all of them, even if they are grounded, but if Kai attempted to move close enough that it would be difficult to time the slide, he gets into range of Shin's longest attack. Kai actually has similar problems against Ino, except that the way in which Ino gets her space advantage is much more limited, i.e. relying almost completely on the huge range, relatively speaking, of her standing dust. She actually does not care whether or not Kai blocks this move most of the time, only whether or not she is vulnerable to anything he does afterwards, and the answer to that is almost always no at the lower levels of play, and it's still usually no at the higher levels. Meaning that Kai does end up being similarly daring against a lot of Ino's attacks, which tends to work out better for him because Ino has less control over the space directly over her head than, for example, Shin does. She can definitely hit him and trade, but sometimes it's a little bit too much work. And it can be much more dangerous for her. Interestingly, one of her best options when Kai finally decides he's going to try to play an aerial game against her is her instant jump dust, which is a strong attack in a lot of matchups, but is one of her cleanest ways of clipping the sort of character that wants to hang in the air and stress her from there. In fact, a good Ino can even convert off this, at least in this matchup, treating it as an upward air-to-air for when Kai decides to get to I lost the word. But you get the idea. Kai goes into the air too much, Ino expects it, and can just instant jump dust a bunch of stuff. She does, however, have to be fairly confident about this, the same way Sin has to be confident on the ground. Otherwise, Kai will manage to hit with one of his normals, and convert a lot better than she normally can. However, getting used to watching for this situation means she's also much more likely to understand and figure out when she can anti-air normally and wouldn't have to deal with it at all.
またいつでもお相手します。はい、勝ちだ。闘志ではなく殺意が向けられていた。支援もなくそこまで変質することが可能なのか。あなたは一体。
As you can see, applying the same principles as in fighting Axel 2 Sin causes similar motions. While you cannot bait Sin into making too many of the same types of mistakes, causing him to hesitate long enough for you to land near him and actually get your pressure or at least some heavy checks on Sin's zoning going, is generally highly advantageous to you. So overall, your aim is again to try to get far away and then try to use your green block and particular methods of air dash to close the distance in time to get started.
あなたいいわよ。私もムードより食欲。もっとその元気をちょうだい。
Against Kai's pressure, Sin has relatively fewer options due to the slow startup on his invincible Hawk Baker. He therefore often has to use jump back tactics, using the reach on his attacks to clip Kai out of the air on the approach, but this is difficult to time. Meaning that a lot of the time the safest thing he can do, if he's managed to build up enough meter by that point, is to use his dead angle attack to push Kai off altogether. Since this is actually difficult to execute as well, it should of course be used sparingly given that it will also use up meter. This jumping back strike method is actually even more useful on Ino than it is against Kai. Generally, this is because Ino's attacks, when going downward, tend to miss Sin entirely if he jumps back in that way. And his tendency to hang in the air means that he generally won't be clipped by any of her grounded attacks, even if she attempts to follow it up and he's actually rather slow.
際どい勝負でした。はい、勝ちだ。デュエル2、さっさと次行こうぜ。下で本気を見せましょう。できる。はい、てら
動かない。生きて
てら見えてますよ。
もう終わり。歓喜できる。嬉しいです。
できる。
受けてって。
できる。てらできる。
しばっちゃう。もう終わり。
これな。見えてますよ。これな。てらそこ。
嬉しいでしょ。
もらった。
受けてって。
見えてますよ。てら
生きて受けてって。
勝負。なんて威力。
受けてって。
こんなで
嬉しいです。受けてって。
こっちもこれな。本気を見せましょう。やべえぞ。マジでいけ。
動かない。
なんて威力。ここだ。やべえぞ。マジでいけ。
受けてって。しばっちゃう。
今すぐ。そこ。本気で。
動かないでね。もう終わり。
またいつでもお相手します。はい、勝ちだ。闘志ではなく殺意が向けられていた。今さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みっこなしだ。デュエル1、やっちまえ。動くな。次に行け。この見えだぜ。 順調。俺勝ちだ。デュエル2、様子見してんなよ。おいおい、
しまっちゃう。受け取って
安息君。好きにしてやるよ。
勝つ。
やってるな。
受け取って気を使って動かない。動かない。受け取って動かない。受け取って
冗談じゃねえ。デュエル2、全部出し切るよな。
しまっちゃう。
Similarly, you should remember, as demonstrated in the prior match, if you do an instant jump back move, especially one that causes you to hang in the air, and then descend afterwards, as long as you were able to launch another attack, you were also able to green block in the air, meaning that your opponent cannot necessarily anti-air you just because you whiffed in that way.
もお相手します。はい、勝ちだ。ストレート。基本ができてない。ソルは一体何を教えていたんだ。もっともその潜在の
As we move into the final 15 minutes of our stream for the day, we're going to be talking a little bit about our upcoming content and most likely what we'll be setting out to do for the next year or so. We've been playing each of these games long enough that even though technically, in certain ways, we're definitely still playing at the beginner level, it wouldn't be too much of a jump to shift and improve more with a little bit more time invested. As a result, a lot of our older content will be much more relevant to people coming into the FGC after EVO, or just trying to learn fighting games because they've never touched them before EVO or not. Even our latest bots will have a tendency to be more complicated and a lot more optional in a lot of ways. However, the latest patch for Dragon Ball FighterZ seems to have added something along the same lines as the multiple slots for recording. Whether or not this is actually capable of allowing us to create Dragon Ball FighterZ bots is still to be decided and checked, but if it is, given that that is our newest game and therefore the one we are still functionally beginners enough at, a lot of our content may be shifting toward that side. We will of course continue to have our Street Fighter mishmashing battle lounges on Mondays. And the Tuesday Train and Kame House lobbies are unlikely to move either. But if you've been stopping by mostly to see Street Fighter content on Wednesdays and Fridays, you can expect that that might be shifting, possibly entirely to Dragon Ball, or just to other games in general, meaning that Wednesday is no longer guaranteed to be Sandbag Casuals or similar. This is furthermore true because, as noted, the team has been ranking up somewhat in Street Fighter, and we've gathered most of the information we could probably want to with the recent release of both Sagat and G at the same time. And both of them having fighting styles that are relatively easy to discern. Unless absolute new technology comes up, there's not going to be a lot of reason for Sandbags specifically, at least not in a way that can be watched, that is helpful to players that are in the skill tier that we've been targeting thus far. Since we don't intend to expand our content that much in any higher direction, we're more likely to be shifting to learning entirely new games and seeing if there are any differences in the principles that apply. But of course, you can always request help with our bots, or join us in the same Street Fighter Mishmash Lounge, as even if some of the team ranks up, we're still likely to have beginner style or upper bronze tier style content for Street Fighter in that lounge on Mondays. After all, not everyone has that much time, and as much as bots help, time is always one of the deciding factors in how good you can get at fighting games in general. It is a hobby that requires either a clear idea of how high you want to go, or nearly infinite dedication so that every time you meet a new challenge, you just decide, I'm going to spend 2 to 3 hours dealing with that. Except that it's more like 20 hours, and challenges appear like every match. As some say, fighting games are more of a lifestyle than a gaming choice. Which is probably why we have all our esports. That said, tomorrow particularly will still definitely be Sandbag Casuals with a little of Sagat Bot in the background. And of course, on Friday, from the looks of it, we will be debuting the disc guidance for Sagat Bot himself. The bot is complex enough that we don't intend to release any prototype. You'll just get the full version on our upcoming Sunday. And so, once again, we close out our stream on top of the Tuesday train. As mentioned, tomorrow is Sandbag Casuals, Friday is Disc Guidance for Sagat Bot. Thursday will, as usual, be Kame House lobbies for Dragon Ball fighters. Once again, note that these are always US East Coast lobbies, but we're not too picky about the lag. So if you happen to be on the same internet backbone line, go on in and try it out, see if it's unbearable for you or us. You might be surprised. And the worst that will happen if you are not surprised is that you get to Know that for sure and then move on. Next week Monday will of course be more Street Fighter Mishmash Lounge content. We may have more G and Sagat to show off by then. Bringing us back around to next week, Tuesday, for another Tuesday train. Note of course that the Dragon Ball Fighters update is tomorrow. Maybe you may get a look at some of the newer characters on Thursday. And by newer I mean more Goku. There's even a chance that you will get to see the Go Cubed and the Vita twins. But one way or another, we've come to the end of this Tuesday train. So we're getting off at this station. This has been Aurelian for Team 2MK. Good night, everyone.